In the last 2 weeks, as we've chosen the A readings to correspond with our scrutinies, I preached about encounters with God. 2 weeks ago, I shared the story of 3 encounters with God that came in very different ways and from very different places. I told the story of a woman who is a friend of mine who encountered God at a women's shelter back home. The Israelites had encountered God at a rock on Mount Horeb, and the woman in the gospel story that weekend encountered Jesus at the well. In that first weekend, I asked the question, where do you go to meet God for life-giving waters? Last week, I shared about a man born blind and his encounter with God, and the journey of faith that helped him to move from blindness to sight, from sight to insight, and then from insight to faith. And I made the point that that's God's desire for all of us, that we make that similar pilgrimage of faith, that we ourselves move from not being able to see to seeing, from blindness to sight, from not understanding to understanding, from sight to insight, and from unbelieving to believing, from insight into faith. And today we look at another encounter with God in the story of the raising of Lazarus. And what I find interesting and a little bit different about this particular encounter with God is this. In the first story, the woman at the well has a very personal encounter with Jesus. The woman at the well was the only one there at the well at that time. It was just her and Jesus alone. In the story of the man born blind, the encounter he has with Jesus was with the blind man and Jesus alone. Now, very soon his family became involved and the Pharisees became involved, but only in the sense of giving witness and giving testimony to what had happened. Today's encounter with God, as I see it, is a little bit different. It begins with the faith of Martha and Mary, and in particular Martha. Poor Martha always gets a bad rap from the story of Martha and Mary inviting Jesus into their home. Martha does all the work. Mary sits at the feet of Jesus. Martha begins to complain, and then Jesus says to her, "Martha, Martha, Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her." Well, in today's gospel, if she needed redemption, Martha redeems herself. Jesus has not yet even come into town, and Martha runs out to meet him, and she confronts him. And now I think there's just a little bit of anger in her words at first. She says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And then I think she catches herself, and her real faith is shown when she says, "But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." This is real faith. Jesus, I know Lazarus would not have died if you had been here, but even now I know you can change this. Even now I know that with you, everything's going to be okay. That's faith. And Jesus says to her, "Your brother will rise." And Martha responds, "I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." And these next lines are so very important. Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." And then he asks a very important question to Martha. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? When you experience a death, do you really believe that your loved one will live again? The loved one that you miss so terribly right now, do you believe that they are alive with God? That death is not the last word. Jesus says, "For everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Having that kind of faith is the first challenge of a genuine encounter with God. But there's another challenge in today's gospel. Remember, the first 2 encounters we did the last 2 weekends were personal encounters, the woman at the well and the man born blind. But this one involves a whole lot of other people. Because not only are there many people watching as this encounter takes place, but they are immediately given a role in helping Lazarus after his being raised from the dead. You see, after Jesus says, "Roll away the stone," take away all that separates the living from the dead, after Jesus yells, "Lazarus, come out," and after Lazarus takes those first steps out of the tomb, then Jesus says this, "Untie him and let him go free." Untie him and let him go free. I think about that. Untie him and let him go free. I kind of thought originally, wasn't Lazarus already free by Jesus calling him out of the tomb? Hadn't Jesus already broken the bonds of death and the chains of death so that Lazarus could be free? But as I read it again, I found that line to be an interesting twist in the story, a twist that I think is important for us to recognize, and a twist that was not apparent in these other two encounters with God. Lazarus may have been raised from the dead, but there was no life until he was untied, until he was unbound. In other words, the people in his life must help him to live, or he will continue to be dead. St. John uses a lot of symbolism in his gospel, and I think symbolically, John wants us to hear our own story in this story that he tells. Some of us, I suspect, are like Martha and Mary, who know the right words of faith, but who don't always know how to put them into action. I suspect that some of us are like Lazarus. We've been raised with our own encounter with God, and now we must learn to live in that encounter. Too many of us, however, I think walk around stiff legs, waiting to be unbound. Too many of us have received the gift of new life, but have not been set free to experience it. We need each other. We need church to unite us and let us go free. Some of us are tied up by our habits and our beliefs. Some of us are tied up by fear and apprehension. Some of us are tied up by guilt and blame, and some of us are bound by grief and heartache. In my 30-plus years as a priest, I've heard countless stories of people who were so tied up in the burial clause of hurt and pain and disappointment that they couldn't see a way out. But even more often, I've heard stories of people who have been unbound. I've met people who have come out of really bad addictions and have found a church, the place that they can become unbound. I've encountered people who have come from troubled or broken homes and found a loving environment here that is both freeing and life-giving. At Easter this year, we'll baptize 13 new Catholics. Many of them are here today. Baptism is a sacramental equivalent of being called forth from the tomb, a place where we hear Christ call our name and know that we have received new life. In baptism, God gives us new life. In baptism, we are restored from life or to life from death. But baptism itself does not unbound us. The unbinding must happen in and through the church where we grow in our faith. The unbinding occurs each time we gather here to worship. The unbinding happens in every classroom of our school and Faith Life program. The unbinding takes place each time we empower someone to serve Christ. And the unbinding takes place in every Bible study, Alpha series, hour of adoration, or discipleship group. And all of these can be encounters with God. My prayer for all of us is that as we approach the holiest week of our church year, that we might be released from all that still binds us, and we may be set free every time we encounter God, especially in this Holy Eucharist.